Very
Excellent, thank you. So I'm just going to entertain you as people are trickling in with the name situation. So I'm Ukrainian, which is my name is Alexandra, and that's something that I have to put in all my papers, but it's just nobody in my life calls me that. So I have to put Sasha so that people know who they're talking to, but all my papers are with this really long and beautiful name that I don't identify with at all times. But in any case, so I'm a researcher at the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning, and it's in University of South Australia, Adelaide, where we are now at 6:30 p.m. in the evening. And I'm going to present to you work that I've done together with Jelena Jovanovic from the University of Belgrade. And the title of the paper, as Yishan has said, is Intergroup and Interpersonal Forum Positioning in Shared Thread and Post-Reply Networks. So, networks in learning analytics are often constructed from the discussion relationships in online forums. They have conventionally been used for the analysis of learning. There's been a lot of very early lab work around that, looking at the relationship between learner degree, which is positioning in the network, or rather the number of people you talked to, and a grade, for instance, or your creativity score, or your sense of self, of belonging. And more recently, so in the last couple of years, learning analytics researchers have been pointing out that the relationship between learner positioning in these online communication networks and learning outcomes, especially grades, are inconsistent. And so very often this inconsistency has been explained by the variability of choices that researchers take when they construct their networks. More specifically, a paper some years ago by Alyssa Wise and colleagues that said, well, you know, look, we construct networks from discussion forums in all sorts of ways, but there are two extremes. So there's one extreme that's post-reply network, and there's another extreme that's a co-presence, or what I call here shared thread network. Ultimately, on the one side, we have this relationship where a learner replies to another learner, and we build a network based on just that. But on the other side, we have all the learners who were in the same thread, and we build relationships between all of them and analyze those networks. And these are two extremes. And so colleagues show, both through statistical and descriptive analyses, that depending on how you build your network, your results will be very different. And so the real question that I have had for many years is, so what should we do? I mean, it's obvious that they're different. It's obvious that when you make these different choices, you're going to have different results. Okay, so what? And so the motivation from this paper is really a personal need. I was working on a paper with a colleague, Nia Dowell, and my job was very, very simple. I needed to derive learner positioning metrics from a network. So just construct a network, derive the conventional degree, betweenness, closeness, things that we often do. And so we spent a month and 2 months and 3 months, and I kept having this conversation. I was like, I'm not sure. I'm just not sure which network to choose, because I don't really know. I can't make this choice. As a network researcher who's been doing work in this area, I still don't know. And so the curiosity that I had was, are these two different extremes? Are these two different models of social interactions? Are they actually different things? And so I want to unpack a little bit this motivation, because I have several assumptions that informed a lot of the choices that will be further, so sort of my methodology and results are informed by this motivation. There's a lot more in the paper itself, so you can read all the theoretical and the literature review, but I just wanted to flag those things. So in my view, network is a model, which means it's not just a representation of data that sits in a system. It's an analytical set of, it's a set of analytical choices that we make to represent a phenomenon of interest. Now, when we derive positioning in these networks of a learner, we also then assuming that that positioning theoretically is associated with a particular outcome. And we also make an assumption theoretically that the ties in these networks, they are relationships that foster these outcomes. And so then when you look at a learning setting, both the post-reply behavior, that is a communication action, a choice that a learner makes explicitly, as well as talking and being present with many people, they're two somewhat close but also somewhat different behaviors. They can both lead to learning. And so in that sense, I don't know which one is better and whether they are actually different or the same in terms of representing social learning in a forum. And so starting from this motivation, I iterate the curiosity, which is, are the two models or networks as models, are they different? And so there are two questions that the paper answers. One is, does learner centrality in a post-reply network differ from a learner centrality in a shared thread network? So do the metrics for each learner across the two networks that are constructed differently, how similar or different are they? And the second question is, what is the relationship between learner centrality in one network and learner centrality in another network, which is slightly different, and I'll explain why, because we used a special method to tease out this relationship. So it's not a correlation, we use a different methodology. And so before I go any further, it is important that I talk about the definitions. Again, I'm keeping this low theoretical, but there is theory grounding some of these in the paper. So I'll be talking and comparing learner positioning in two networks. One is something that Jelena and I defined as interpersonal network, which is relationships between people based on communication behavior of hit and reply in the forum to the post of a person. So if I replied to somebody and the system recorded that reply, that's a tie. Potential outcome of that tie is information exchange or knowledge construction or cognitive presence. Potential outcome because we don't really know whether that outcome has been achieved, right? We're not teasing that out here fully. But theoretically, it's possible that these are the outcomes of an interpersonal position, of positioning in an interpersonal network. The second network that we constructed is intergroup network. Because if you think about it, if all the learners are situated in the same thread and we're tying them all with the relationships based on the thread posting, then we have a group. We have a group and each person belongs to a group based on a thread where they've been. So we are sort of lifting up that shared thread participation into a construct that we refer to as intergroup network positioning. And potentially being in a shared thread network or co-presence network, as Elisa and colleagues refer to it, can lead to outcomes such as common ground establishment, negotiating meaning, absorbing values and norms, and also being aware of the group. I mean, these are all the outcomes that the learner can obtain by being a part of the discussion thread. And so based on these two definitions, the methodology that we took to examine the differences between positioning in these two networks were as follows. First, we constructed the networks in a particular manner, and I'll explain that because this is very important. Secondly, we derived network centralities from both networks, and we clustered learners using k-means clustering on the network centralities in one network and in another network. And we then compared the overlap between the clusters. And so this way we saw how many people had high measures in intergroup network versus high measures in interpersonal network, or low measures in intergroup positioning, had low intergroup positioning versus low interpersonal positioning, etc. And the second research question was about the relationship between the two positioning measures. So the way we asked, or the way we addressed that question was whether one's positioning in a shared thread network affects the creation of ties in post-reply networks and vice versa. So we looked at these two networks in relation to one another and analyzed them temporally as if they co-evolve. And so we applied statistical analysis for that, and I'll show the results. Importantly, network construction. So post-reply networks were constructed as any other or most of these types of things. So as I said, A replied to B and it was weighted. So we explicitly counted the number of times people interacted directly. Shared thread networks, there was a caveat to how we've done that, which is why I have a separate slide Conceptually, we treated shared thread networks first as networks of posts. So all the posts were connected to one another. Then we looked at the time differences between each post, and we counted the mean of the distances between posting and replying within a thread across all pairs of learners. And then we removed ties between the posts for those learners where the timestamp distances were higher than the mean. I mean, what does that approach actually do? It does something very, very simple. If you have those humongous threads where you have hundreds of people posting, because it's a shared thread network, right? The common critique was that you can't really build a group of 100 people because it's unrealistic. So that's what we're trying to address here by looking at the closeness of posting within a thread and removing the ties between all those people in a thread where the time of posting is higher. So if, let's say, 3 of us talked in a discussion thread in 1 week, and then at the end of the semester, the 4th learner comes in and posts something, that learner wouldn't be a part of that discussion thread because we would filter them out based on the mean of time distances. And only then, once the sort of the later relationships between the posts were removed, then we projected these post-post networks to learner network. And what it does is that it doesn't remove learners, but removes relationships between some learners based on timing. So it's a small thing that I think mattered a lot here conceptually. We also did a somewhat different thing in terms of weighting of the edges. So that's based on the work by Newman from 2001. So I'll just explain briefly. So imagine that this is learner A and learner B, and they have co-participated in 3 discussion threads. Now in this discussion thread, it was only a discussion between the 2 of them. Well, in this discussion thread, there were 4 people altogether. This is a pool of 4 here. And this discussion thread, the last discussion thread, had 3 posters in total. So using the formula, we weighted the total number of threads shared as well as total number of people present on those threads, and then summed that up to produce a weight that describes the relationships between learners A and B based on their thread participation. And the final step of the analysis methodologically was using stochastic actor-oriented models to analyze how interpersonal networks and intergroup networks changed over time across 3 time slices. Now, I probably wouldn't get to talk to it, but if anybody's interested in the technical parts, there were a few caveats there as well. So I want to spend a bit of time explaining what the network coevolution does, because I think that's where the results are more interesting, and perhaps not everybody's familiar with that. So we have 2 time slices. This is a small dialogue in time 1. Learner A says, "What do you think of X?" Learner B replies directly, "I think it is relevant." Learner C replies to learner B, "I think I disagree with you, B. It is not relevant at all," which is reflected here with B replying to A and C replying to B. And then D replies to A because it's at the same level, saying, "I don't know, we can use X." So that is an example of interpersonal network in time 1. Intergroup network would look like all of these people having ties with one another. So A and B and C and D would be interconnected. But for modeling purposes, because we wanted to tease the relationships between the 2 levels of networks, so these yellow nodes, we only kept for intergroup networks the ties that were indirect. So here, because A and B share an interpersonal tie of replying, it is removed from A and B network, it is removed from intergroup network between A and B, so that we don't count the same relationship twice. And then I have in time 2, again, another example of a dialogue and some kind of relationships between these nodes. So ultimately what the modeling has done is that it looked at the 2 levels of activity. So interpersonal network and intergroup network change from time 1 to time 2 with different sets of hypotheses. So one hypothesis looked at whether a direct tie between 2 people in time 1 will lead to a tie between 2 people in time 2. For instance, if learner B and A have a direct tie in time 1, they would also have a direct tie in time too. That would be one type of hypothesis. Another type of hypothesis would be like here, you see D talks directly to A. We hypothesize, well, does it mean that A will also reciprocate in time too? Another example of a hypothesis here was about closure. So if C-B-A relationships are present in time 1, will we see the closure of that triad from C to A in time 2? So that was one set of hypotheses. The second set of hypotheses, all modeled within the same model, was looking at whether the intergroup network changes. So again, do we have more ties if people co-occurred in one thread in time 1? Will they also co-occur in time 2, for instance? The third types of hypothesis examined if people talk directly to one another in time 1, will they talk or will they co-occur with one another in time 2 in a participation thread? And the last set of hypothesis is if people were in the same thread in time 1, will it lead to them talking directly to one another in time 2? And so what we found, so first regarding the positioning in two networks, so this was done in a MOOC. And for 37% of the students, the positioning into networks didn't coincide. What it means? It means that, so you here have this breakdown of the low measures in one network and in another, and you can see that for 489 people, the measures were low in both networks. It's a MOOC, it makes sense, people don't all participate. But for the remainder of people, so for 36%, the high positioning in intergroup network did not necessarily correspond to high positioning in interpersonal network. What that means, it means that we're looking at a number of different social behaviors that occur from being in a collective discourse as well as from being a part of sort of more direct and explicit engagement with other learners. And more interesting and really busy here, so I'll just summarize it succinctly, is the relationship between the two networks. So what we found is all our hypotheses were confirmed, and I mean, I've done this modeling on other networks, and I've never seen that good a fit, which really surprised me, which sort of led me to believe that we're actually asking some things that, finding things that are quite meaningful. So what we found basically is that if you participate in a thread with somebody, you're likely to participate in a thread with that person over time. As well as if you talk to somebody directly in the beginning, you're likely to talk to this person directly later on. But more interestingly, we also found that there is a cross-network relationship. So if you are in a thread with somebody, you're more likely to engage with this person directly as the time continues. And to me, that is an important finding because it taps into the mechanisms of direct formation of relationships that are not necessarily mediated by knowing who you're talking to, but being in a shared discourse. And if you're around for in about an hour, I'll be talking more about some of these mechanisms in a different talk. So that was an important finding, showing that there is a causal relationship between being in a thread and talking to somebody directly, and that is something that is circular over time throughout the course. So the implications, I think I'm way over time here, so I'm just going to wrap this up, is that it turns out that post-reply networks and shared thread networks do measure somewhat distinct social behaviors. And we try to classify the clusters, and you can read those about social butterflies and selective socials, and all of that is in the paper. So where to from this is, well, maybe we should better understand which types of these more varied social behaviors lead to better learning outcomes, whether these different social behaviors are associated with social competences. So work by Sandra Milligan maps out really nicely how people can be competent in social activity. What does that translate to in terms of what they actually do in terms of participation with others? And as I said, this last point, there are very important implications for network formation because this study teases out the mechanisms. I think I'm going to stop here and thank you. Questions?